Winter settled into the folds of the Barrowlands like a great white beast finding at last the hollow that fit its bones. Snow iced the lashings of the sleighs and froze breath to mustaches. Leather hardened and cracked if held too near the fire, and men learned the rhythm of thaw and chill as they learned the rhythm of war. On the second day after the stone bridge fell, they rode under a sky the color of old pewter until the glow of Winterfell's watchfires painted the undersides of the clouds, a dim orange promise against the iron. The gates opened to them like a yawn. Smells crashed together, horse and smoke, boiled onions, the sour tang of the tannery, the resin-sweet breath of new-cut pine. The people of Wintertown put down sledges and shouldered poles to watch the riders pass. Some called blessings. Most simply stared with a hungry kind of hope that made Ned ache in places deeper than his wounds. They wanted the war to be over because they were cold and tired and their children's boots leaked, not because of banners or birthrights. He took off his glove and raised his bare hand and met as many eyes as he could until the throng thinned and the courtyard stones took them in. Catelyn stood beneath the covered gallery, her hair braided away from wind and work, her cheeks chapped by the cold. She watched Selmy carry Robert's hammer as if it were a slumbering child and watched Ned dismount with the shock of someone who has rehearsed a reunion 100 times and still finds the lines wrong. When she crossed to him, her hands were warm. He did not realize the snow that had melted on his cheeks was not all snow until she took his face and he saw her lips form his name without sound. After the greetings and the shifting of burdens and the long march of small reports, after Meege Mormont had clout Theon Greyjoy on the shoulder hard enough to unseat a lesser man and Roose Bolton had bowed without letting his eyes flicker so much as a nerve, after Rickon had flown at Ned's knees and Arya had shown him a bruise the color of ripened plums from a fall while practicing, after Bran had looked up at him solemn as a carved saint and Sansa had sung 2 lines of a new song for the fallen king and stopped because the room had gone quiet, after all that, when the hall had thinned and torches guttered and the wolves had curled themselves in their accustomed corners, they went together down into the crypts. The lantern threw long shadows along the faces of the stone lords. Ned thought, not for the first time, how alike they all were in the end. The same slow patience of granite, the same sightless, tireless regard. Catelyn's hand tightened on his sleeve when they passed Lyanna. The old pain flared and subsided like a coal breathed upon. They knelt at Robert's bier, the stag banner drawn close against the cold, the crown set upon the cloth as a sentinel. "I have written Stannis," Ned said. His words echoed among the dead. "I would see Robert laid at Storm's End if there is to be a Storm's End left to lay him in. Stannis will be gladdened by the honor and made suspicious by the courtesy," Catelyn answered, with the kind of weary humor only long marriages brew. "He will ask what you want in return." "Only what I have always wanted," he said. "A realm without rot. And you will never have that." Catelyn squeezed his hand. "But you can have less rot. That will have to serve." On the walk back up, Bran's voice came to him as if from far away, though the boy was just at his elbow. "I dreamed the queen fell," Bran said, "into black water. It was cold and the cold made a sound like singing." "She is gone," Ned said, and meant it as comfort, though the boy's face stayed grave. "If she is, the realm is changed." "It is changed," Bran said, "but not in the way that matters most." Osha, standing a step behind, met Ned's gaze over Bran's head. "He hears things," she said softly, as if the cold could eavesdrop. "Better to listen than to laugh." "I am not laughing," Ned told her, and himself. He sent Corran Halfhand back to the Shadow Tower the next morning with a brace of fresh horses and letters bearing the direwolf seal. "Tell your old bear the North will answer if the wall calls," Ned said. Corran lifted 2 fingers in a scarce visible salute and vanished into a weather that swallowed men whole. The morning after that, a raven came with Stannis's Taxure script compressed to a single strip of parchment. "Robert will lie in the Stormlands. The flesh belongs to his blood, the crown to the law. I will have both. I will accept your recognition and your levy, and in return I will swear to the safety of your lands, the punishment of treason, and the ending of lions' hunger. The Red Woman advises iron and fire. I prefer iron. Send the body by sea at thaw. Stannis of House Baratheon. Beneath, in a tighter hand, a second strip. I am Davos Seaworth, called the Onion Knight. If you can bear the stink of common sense, I ask leave to come to Winterfell for words. Ned showed both scraps to Catelyn. Send for him, she said without hesitation. If Stannis has any part not bound in iron, you may find it through this Davos. He sent for him. Lord Wyman's son Wylis returned to White Harbor to receive the envoy and carry him north. With him Ned dispatched other ravens. To Doran Martell, where the quills had to be sharpened thrice because the words Elia and Justice cut grooves if you let them. To the Eyrie, though Lisa Aaron's gates had more iron than air. To Lord Hoster at Riverrun by way of Blackfish Brinden, whose seals always smelled faintly of fish and damp. To the twins, though he knew no wax mark softened Walder Frye. And to Tywin Lannister himself, 3 sentences that would sour milk in the udder. Your daughter is dead in the North's waters. I did not strike the blow that took her life. I did break the bridge that stopped her army. If you want a corpse more than you want a kingdom, send your son and your banners north, and we will end this under snow. If you want a kingdom more than a corpse, recall your banners from Riverrun, surrender the lion's crown, and let the law make a king. He will laugh, Catelyn said. Perhaps, Ned answered, or he will count. He is better at counting than laughing. In King's Landing, men and women who had never seen the snow-built snow lions in courtyards with soot and chalk and red wine for the manies, a new sort of cruelty. Tyrion stood on the inner bailey with a goblet. He didn't drink and watched a group of urchins pelt such a lion with handfuls of slush until its nose fell off and its eyes ran red. A campaign poster, he told Bronn, if we had paper enough. A day later, the first broadsheets with woodcuts of a lioness tumbling into wild waters appeared. The words beneath were Varys's, the block printing Peter's coin, the feeling of relief entirely Tyrion's. Cersei had been a gravity in every room she entered. Without her, the castle breathed. Joffrey tried to bark himself swollen to a replacement size, but Marjorie Tyrell only smiled and took his arm and led him around the sharpest corners. Tyrion wrote a letter that he did not send to Jaime. She is gone. You survive. Do not let those be the only 2 truths you tell yourself. Instead, he sent practicalities. The chain would be repaired. The guilds were fed for a month with Tyrell grain. The Septons were paid to preach about obedience and snow as a sign of the mother's displeasure with northern indulgence. He sent another letter to Tywin. We can hold the city. We cannot hold your quarrels. Look where the large pieces have fallen and nudge. Don't shove. It went unacknowledged. At Riverrun, Tywin did something no singer would ever ink. He sat very still and thought. There are moments when war is muscle and moments when it is joint. You must know the difference. The Queen dead meant the city's politics would ice over for a while. Ice is not the same as strength. He could push down the river now and make a cairn of fish and stone, and then the north would harden around the moat like a throat around a bone. Or he could go back to the capital and tie up the loose threads before they knotted themselves into a noose. He wrote a curt order that wheeled half the host south and left the other grim as a vine around Riverrun, then sent for more coin. In the night, he dreamt of a river frozen solid and woke angry that he could not put an army on it. Walder Frye sucked rat-tail soup through toothless gums and blinked in satisfaction when Balon Swan arrived with Cersei's writ. Paramount, is it? He said to the knot of sons and grandsons whose names he could not always keep track of. Paramount makes a man tall enough to see both shores. The trick is to tell which bank will flood first. He pinned the paper to a beam with a carving knife and told his steward to fetch twice as much ale to the lion tents and twice as many blankets to the wolf ravens. Frye generosity. North of the neck, Robb took Moat Cailin with less violence than men had earned there in generations. The castles were ruins, the causeway a throat of muck and winter-slashed stone. He placed Great John in the crumbling North Tower and left a garrison there big enough to make an army ticklish and small enough not to starve itself. His letter home read like the man he was becoming, short on the parts that asked a father to be proud, long on numbers of sacks and spears and days until the swamp froze hard. His seal was clean. Ned read it twice and wrote back with the words he thought a lord should hear. You did well. He slipped in the words a father would say under them like a brace beneath a beam. I am proud. Do not let the pride be the part you hear loudest. The envoy from Dragonstone came with the stink of tar and salt and humility. Davos Seaworth had hands missing the top joints of fingers. He told the truth about how he lost them before anyone asked. He had eyes that looked like gods had been a boat he consulted only when the stars failed him. That made Ned trust him more. They spoke in the solar while Catelyn laid out maps. You're the first southern man this winter to come north with nothing in your hand but a message, Catelyn said when he had delivered Stannis' terms. Everyone else brings a writ like a blade. I brought onions once, Davos answered. They saved a castle, or a part of it. Men forget, though. They remember ships more. Ships look like swords if you stand on a cliff and squint. We have some ships, Wyman Manderly's letter had said, the day after the Blackwater. We can have more if you send iron and patience. Davos shook his head when Ned told him that. You will need every plank. Stannis means to take King's Landing by sea again if Tywin marches. He's stubborn in a way that looks like strength until it turns into loss. What does he offer us beyond justice? Ned asked. Justice, if it arrives with bread, Davos said. He offers that. He offers to leave you the north. He offers to take the war on as his to carry and his to be crushed under if the weight is too much. He offers to punish my king's memory in the ways that honor requires and reward it where honor should have and didn't. And the Red Woman? Davos's mouth flattened. She offers fire. My king is a flint. She strikes him and he sparks. There are times in a storm when you need a spark. There are times when sparks burn the only rope you have. What would you have me do? Ned asked, surprising himself by asking. I'd have you give him your word and your ships and keep your wolves at home, Davos said without flinching. I'd have you tell him when he's mad and tell him when he's mean and save a part of the realm the rest of us keep forgetting is part of the realm until we look north and find snow in the wind. And when the snow isn't just snow. He stopped. There are stories. There is a wall, Ned said. It is not a story. Good, Davos said. Then we've got one thing in our favor that isn't a prayer. He left the next morning with a sack of oats, a bag of salt, and the kind of letter men like Stannis keep under their breastplate to touch when they need to be reminded that someone north of their ambition remembers that law is a thing you carry, not a thing you are. The same day, Howland Reed's children came out of the bogs like marshlights. Mira with a net and a smile and a spear whose point was ground from a piece of green glass that had never seen a smith's fire, and Jojen with eyes that looked 1,000 days away. They bowed to Ned and kissed Catelyn's hand and went to Bran without asking leave, as if the house itself had invited them. That night in the Godswood, under boughs that hid more red than bark, Jojen told Bran how he had dreamed of a great weirwood whose face looked north and south at once, and of a wolf who slept under it and dreamed a boy who dreamed a wolf that woke under the boy's skin. There's a storm that isn't of this war, Jojen said, and the way through it isn't with spears. Spears help, Arya cut in because she had stolen after them and because nothing Arya believed didn't involve steel. They do, Mira agreed cheerfully, twirling her net. But if you throw a spear at a storm, the storm throws it back. You need a place to stand where the wind can't knock you over. The roots give you that. The roots are far north. Osha put in from the shadows. Under the snow and under the ice and under the bones of men who don't rot right enough to call themselves dead. Bran's hand rested on the weirwood's bleeding bark. He spoke then in a voice that was his and not his and old. Father, he said without turning his head, because Ned had come and stood behind with the silence the gods teach you. The wall is not only to keep things out, it is to keep something in. It has started to remember itself. When a thing remembers its name and it's a big thing with a bad name, men who think they decide wars find out they are wrong. What do you see? Ned asked because the only way to get a straight path through a wood is to ask the trees which way they've grown. Snow, Bran said, and blue eyes in a face whiter than frost, and a sword that isn't a sword because it never cut and always cuts. Also crows. Too many crows. He looked up, and for a moment Ned saw something that wasn't a boy at all peering through the boy's face like sunlight through a frost-blurred pane. Then it was Bran again, rubbing at his wrist. It doesn't make sense when I say it, he muttered, a little embarrassed. It makes too much sense, Ned said slowly, which is to say none at all. He rested his palm against the old bark. Sap tackied his hand, and the smell went into him like medicine. I will send more grain to the wall, and men, and I will speak to Stannis about the wall when men are speaking of crowns. In the days that followed, ravens beat their ink-black wings against Winterfell's windows as if the castle's heartbeat had flown outward and returned, bruised and furious. One brought a warning from the Shadow Tower, a hunter's cave with bones chewed and thrown aside like a dog's leavings. But the bones were man-shin and man-femur. Giants, Jeor Mormont wrote under his seal. They do not eat men. Something eats men. The giants are running. Another carried a report from Eastwatch. A pattern burned into the snow around a watchtower in a spiral the size of a keep. No footprints led away. A third held a scrap of cloth so cold to the touch Ned had to set it by the fire before he could unroll it. Inside, written in ink that glimmered faintly blue, were 7 words. The dead do not burn as they should. He showed that one to Roose Bolton. Bolton's face did not change. The men of the Dreadfort have a saying, he remarked. What's cold never truly warms. Unless it's alive, and some things that seem alive aren't. He turned the scrap in long pale fingers. This is not a war we know how to fight. It is a war we will have to, Ned said. Bolton inclined his head. When the night takes away the colors, he said, it is harder to tell a friend from a foe. He tucked the scrap inside his sleeve where the heat of his arm could not have done much to warm it even if he had wanted it warmed. Theon Greyjoy asked to go to pike. He asked it the way men ask for a knife with the point toward them and the haft away. If anyone can turn him, Catelyn said when they were alone, meaning Balon and not saying it, it's the boy he raised as a hostage. I did not raise him as a hostage, Ned said. You raised him as a son, Catelyn replied. He remembers that when it helps him and forgets it when it hurts him. He is his father's son and yours as much as any boy can be 2 men at once. Send him. If he betrays you, that is his second truth. If he doesn't, it's his first. They chose men for him carefully. 2 Manderly captains who could find a sandbar in a blizzard by taste, a tall heart sworn to Ned from childhood, and a septon who wore a salt-stained robe and a sour look and had no fear of deep water. Theon went in a cloak too good to pass for Ironborn and not good enough to shame them, with a letter sealed with the dire wolf and the mermaid in black wax. Balon Greyjoy, the letter said without flourish. You have tested a patience that outlived kings and winters. End it. I offer an end with feasts instead of funerals. Your daughter can keep the rock you love so much if the ships you love more turn to hairy lions. Withdraw from Bear Island, from the stony shore, from Deepwood and Barrowton. We will give you 2 years' worth of tar and timber at fair price and your son whole. Refuse, and I send back your son with a beard the color of stone. He will light a candle to the drowned god with that letter, Theon said, grinning without mirth, and send me back with a hook. Then bring the hook to me, Ned said. I will hang a good hat on it. When Theon left, Arya climbed the palisade and watched the sails vanish into gray. You didn't let me go with him, she said to the heir, which was what she called her father when she was most angry with him. I did not, the heir answered, and she stomped off to beat her practice post until her knuckles bled through the wrap. Later Brienne of Tarth found her there and asked if she wanted a kinder post to beat. You're a woman, Arya said, still panting. I am, Brienne said. So? Arya's grin cracked her scowl and then ate it. Teach me, she demanded, and Brienne set down her own practice blade and said, First we learn to fall. Brienne had come north with a face that looked carved from sorrow and a simple vow that rebuilt itself every time someone looked at it. To keep Catelyn Stark's children breathing. She had nothing else. She had lost every oath a day earlier and needed to spend the rest of her life making new ones. When she bowed before Catelyn, it looked like a woman praying so hard she'd forgotten everything but the posture. When she rose, Catelyn kissed her cheek and said, You will be the shield they talk about when they talk about seasons. Brienne's ears went red and her eyes stayed steady. And in the weeks that followed, the small folk began to forget she was as tall as a door and notice, Instead, that she never once put herself between a child and a pain that belonged to the child to receive. Arya loved her for that. Sansa loved her for what she could be if the world were fair. Rickon loved her because Shaggy Dog liked her, and Shaggy Dog rarely liked anyone who didn't smell like meat. Word came through cracks and keyholes and the mouths of men who had learned to speak in coin that Tyrion had announced a levy on sweet wines and pears, and that Marjorie Tyrell had visited 5 almshouses in one day, and that a singer had been found floating in the Blackwater, with a golden brooch in his mouth the shape of a spider. No one believed that one, but everyone repeated it. Word also came that Tywin had lifted part of the siege and marched south with banners even in the snow, and that the Freys had thrown a feast and not invited anyone worth trusting. "He smells the wind," Brynden Blackfish told Catelyn in a letter that had more fish sense than usual. "Or thinks he does. Men like him mistake the stink of their own fear for weather." From the east came stranger words. Of a girl in a city of spices and lost ships who had walked into a fire and walked out with smaller fires perched on her shoulders that made a noise like a bellows breathing. Some said the city was Karth, some said Meereen. Men who had never crossed water tend to mix their maps. Oberyn Martell wrote to his brother that the smell of roasted lion traveled well and asked Doran again for leave to cross. Doran sent back a poem, which in the Dorish way said no and sounded like yes and meant maybe when the wind changed. Oberyn sharpened his spear and kissed each of his daughters on the brow and promised them a story when he returned. His letters to Winterfell read like a man flicking ash off the end of a ram's horn, impatient and merry. "If the North wants a friend who hates lions more than he hates the cold, you have found him. I have learned to drink the wines that taste like snow, but I have not learned to love them." Theon's ship made pike in a snow squall that should have broken its mast twice and only broke it once. He was rowed to the foot of the seastone chair through a cave that had been a throat before men discovered rock and decided to sit on it. The drowned men's chants thudded like a slow rain under the boom of the surf. Balon Greyjoy sat on the chair with a look that said the sea had given it to him and the land could try to take it if it thought it could swim. Asha stood at his right with salt crystals crusting her braids and laughter flickering behind her eyes like heat lightning. "Father," Theon said, and Balon answered, "Ward." The word cut him across the chest more cleanly than any sword. He laid Ned's letter on a stone warmed by a brazier. The wax softened. The seal cracked. Balon read it once, then again, then tore it across with a look like a net ripping. "The wolf thinks tar and timber are coins he counts," he said. "He thinks salt is a taste, not a god. He thinks ships are made of wood and not men. You smell of him." Asha's mouth twitched. "He smells of us when it pleases him," she murmured, "and of the wolf when it profits him. That's what being alive is, Father. Smelling like what keeps you breathing." Balon's hand struck the stone arm of his chair with a sound that made the braziers flare. "You laugh," he said to Asha, "and you have my name still. You," he stabbed a finger at Theon, "you beg. You were not drowned at the right age." Theon swallowed the words that wanted to come and said, instead, "War takes what it can reach. You taught me that. The wolf is a hard reach from here. The lion is not. We can take Lannisport and go before their bells ring. We can make their ships into ours. We can burn their fields and feed your god's mouth until he drowns on meat." Asha's eyes gleamed. "There's the boy," she said. He was hiding under the wolf's furs, but he was there. Balon's face did not soften. "Lannisport," he repeated. A man tasting a word he had once liked and now thought might be poison. "The land is weak. The land is not ours. The sea is ours." He turned his head and spat into the brazier and steam rose. "We take the moat. We hold it until the wolf starves. Then we take his head. Then we take his house and wear his stone like a skin. That is what the drowned god wants." "The drowned god wants a dozen things every hour," Asha said, amused. "He is greedy. It's one of the things I like about him. But Father, the moat is a cough, not a throat. If you hold it, you hold bad air. If you hold Lannisport, you hold breath." Balon looked at the two of them as if he had raised daughters and wards and ships so that they could now all teach him the same lesson in different ways. "You," he said to Theon, and the word had a shape this time less like an axe and more like a rope. We'll take a ship and raid Bear Island until you skin me a bear. You, to Asha. We'll take my best longships and put the fear of salt in the lion's sleep. I will take Moat Cailin, and when the wolf howls at my gate, I will shove his muzzle into the water and keep it there until his paws stop churning." Theon bowed because anything else would have ended with him feeding fish. Outside the cave, the wind cut through him like a new name. He went to the ship assigned him with the letter in his pocket, torn and stitched back together and torn again. At the stern, he took out a knife and cut away the last thread. Bits of black wax stuck to his fingers like scabs. He scrubbed his hands in the salt barrel and thought, not for the first time, that men like him were always washing something off and never getting clean. When the snows cleared enough to make the roads mostly a hazard instead of a promise of death, Davos returned to Dragonstone with Ned's reply, and Stannis stood on the seawall and read it twice and handed it to Melisandre without looking away from the grey chop. The red woman's mouth curved. "He is a man of ice," she said. "Ice can be used to bank the fire so it does not blow out." "He is a man," Stannis said, "and he keeps his word. The rest is cloth you cut and then find you cut it too short." He sent letters to the Vale and Dorne that had more commas than his writing usually had. Concessions sharpened like knives and invitations disguised as insults. He sent Davos to Gulltown with coin and words and told him not to spend the coin unless he had to, and to strike with the words only where throat met jaw. He told Courtenay Penrose to ready the fleet and told the alchemists he would burn no more city than necessary, which is like telling a storm it can have only the boats men don't love. In King's Landing, Marjorie walked with Joffrey in the garden where the lemon trees had no lemons left. "Do you love me?" Joffrey asked, in the tone of a boy asking if his dog can bite a stag. Marjorie smiled the smile of a woman whose life depended on knowing 100 ways to answer the same question. "I love that the people love you," she said. "I love that you will make the city safe for children." Joffrey's eyes lit with a cruel brightness and then dimmed, confused that she had turned his game into a mirror. He pulled a blossom off a branch and broke it petal by petal. "The northern girl sang about my father," he said, meaning Sansa and not remembering when he had last seen her. "She's not here to sing about me. She sings in the north," Marjorie said. "That is its own kind of crown." Tyrion drilled the gold cloaks. He rebuilt the burned neighborhoods with less theft than usual. He argued with Pycelle about the price of willow bark. He dreamed sometimes of a road that went north and had no taxes and no traps, and in the morning woke and laughed at himself with something like contempt and something like grace. Varys watched the doors and smiled at the way they opened. Littlefinger watched the locks and smiled at the way they clicked. At Riverrun, Edmure made 2 mistakes and 1 good decision. The mistakes involved archers and pride. The good decision involved not riding out when the gates rattled because the Blackfish told him not to. Tywin took his siege towers apart and rebuilt them 1 jam at a time and sent ravens every morning and read none of them before noon. News came of Cersei's death. He did not flinch. News came that Arya Stark had been seen at Harrenhal. He did not twitch. News came that Stannis had offered generous terms to the Dornish. He scowled. "He will offer them sand made of glass and call it wine," he said. Then a message came that Tyrion had raised the tax on luxury cloths, and he actually laughed, once, shortly, like a stone between a mill's teeth. Rumors floated up the Green Fork like the bodies of fish that had too much of winter. That Cersei's hair had been found in a fisherman's net and braided into a rope. That she had not fallen at all but been carried off by river spirits who put her in a palace of ice. That she had struck her head on a stone and the stone had split. That she had swum to the far bank and walked to the rock and sat on it and called it king. Ned let the rumors breed and starve in equal measure. Confirmation makes a martyr. Confusion makes a cold. From the wall, a raven came at last with a tale that did not fit in a letter. The man who brought it was named Dolorous Ed, and he spoke as if every word were something you could trip over in the dark and be embarrassed about. "The old bear said I should tell you," he told Ned in the great hall where the fires had been stoked so hot even the stones sweated. "That the thing we burned did not stay burned unless we used oil thick as something you describe in poor company, and that the horses don't like going where the cold is wrong, and that the men sleep with their eyes not properly shut, and that," he swallowed, and that the dead sometimes stand up and say things the living men said yesterday, and they say them in the same voice, and the sound is like when ice cracks in a pond at midnight. Good, Ned said, because sometimes the only way to keep your hands from shaking is to do something cruel to your own sense of what words are for. Then we know we weren't dreaming a nightmare. He went to the crypts that night again and told Robert, because he would have told him in life when a hunt had gone badly, and because news weighs less when you share it with a man who cannot make it worse. Snowyard drills were longer the next week and shorter the week after. Men tiring are men dying when the wind finds their weak place. Robb sent word from the moat that raiding bands of Krakenmen had tried the causeway and found it deep and old and full of snakes, only some of them made of mud. They will look for higher ground, Robb wrote. I mean to give them none. Meej wrote from Bear Island that she had skinned the first Ironborn herself, and the second had begged for his god, and she had told him the sea was too cold today. Galbart wrote from Deepwood that Asha Greyjoy had the good sense to retreat when the odds turned, and that he wished he had 10 of her with different fathers. Ned saw Brienne spar with Arya and thought of Lyanna with a wooden sword in a garden that smelled of flowers he had not smelled in so long. He could not remember if they were roses. He saw Sansa thread a needle and thought of Catelyn's hands the day he had taken her from Riverrun, and of the way they had tightened when she met the North and decided not to let it scare her. He saw Bran under the heart tree with Jojen and Mira and Osha and thought of promises that wake you in the night tapping your shoulder with a cold finger. He saw Rickon asleep with Shaggy Dog's fur over his feet and thought of the time before sleep knew names. When at last the thaw came in a day that fooled men into thinking spring had won a battle instead of stolen a watch, they brought Robert up out of the earth and put him in a ship dressed like a palace. The Manderley galleys wore white banners and black armbands. Selmy stood with the hammer wrapped and bound like a babe. Davos waited off the mouth of the White Knife in a ship that smelt of onions and salt and the stubborn breath of men who had decided not to drown. Ned touched the crown again and set it in the cedar box and handed it to Selmy. He would have wanted you to carry it, he said, and Selmy's mouth tightened and he nodded once. The horns blew low and long. The oars fell. The ships slid away down a road none of them could see. They sent with him a letter and grain and iron and 500 men who had no business at sea and no patience with men who told them that. The heart tree watched it all without moving. The bark did not soften nor the sap slow. When the wind shifted and the smell of the river turned from ice to mud, Ned thought of every man he had lost to water and to fire and to blades, and he closed his eyes and took a breath that hurt and kept hurting and did not stop until he let it go. Be well, he whispered, because the dead deserve the lie as much as the living deserve the truth. That night, as if in answer, a gray-faced rider came from the south with a banner pole snapped in two and a cut across his face like a second mouth. He fell from his horse at the gate, and the words came out of him like meat from a torn sack. Riverrun, he gasped. They're going to drown it. Explain, Ned said, kneeling so the man would not have to lift his head so far to talk. Tywin, the man said, and blood dripped from his split lip, has set cofferdams. He will flood the fields and turn the moat into a lake with no bottom. He will starve them on an island of their own. And the Freys have brought boats. A slow heat moved through Ned that had nothing to do with fire. Roose, he said when they had the rider on a board with blankets and wine. You will take 2,000 men and move with the ground when it is frozen enough not to swallow them. You will relieve what you can and not die on a road to no gain. Great John will shadow you so you do not end up in a stew pot. Wyman will send casks upriver to undo their dams where he can. Robb will hold the moat, and he paused because saying it makes it so. We'll go to the wall. Catelyn was very quiet for a long time before she said, because you believe your son can hold the neck and your daughter can hold my heart and your house can hold itself. Or because you think if you do not go now you will end up going when it is too late. Yes, Ned said. She kissed him then with a care that made him want to smash something just to feel careless. Bring back the dawn, she whispered against his mouth, or enough of it to count. He entrusted Winterfell to Robb in words and to Catelyn in the places words don't reach. He gave Arya a dagger he had taken from a queen and a promise that she could run as fast as she liked as long as she stopped for water, and she rolled her eyes and hugged him hard. He told Sansa to keep singing even when the songs didn't fit, and she nodded as if he had given her permission to breathe. He told Bran to sleep under the tree and wake when the tree told him, and Bran said he would try, and the tree rustled as if it had a laugh hidden in it. He told Rickon to be a wolf, and Rickon said he had been and would be. He told Roose that flaying men in winter made everything worse, and Roose smiled and said he would not take their skins, only their secrets. He told Meage Mormont to hit things until they stopped moving, and she roared agreement. He told Theon in a letter to do the right thing, and Theon set the letter under a lamp and watched the edges curl black and stopped before the name burned. When he rode out with his escort under a sky that had decided to be blue for a morning and then change its mind by noon, the people of Wintertown watched again, and this time there were more hands lifted than the last time, and more mouths moving in the silent way. He rode with Selmy one day's march, and at the place where the road split, one way to White Harbor, one to the King's Road, Selmy slowed his horse and said, "I have served a king and lost him. I would serve a realm and not lose it." "You will," Ned said. "Just not here. The realm is going to need a man with a hammer and a name to remind it of the parts of itself that aren't clever." Selmy smiled without joy. "The clever parts are what gets us killed. The clever parts keep us from dying sooner." Ned squeezed his arm. "Go with Robert's body. The living need to see the dead where they are supposed to be." He rode on, the trees thinning around him, the world flattening into a sheet of ice and wind and sky where the horizon looked like a blade. Somewhere to the west, Tywin's men were counting stone and water. Somewhere to the east, Stannis was counting masts and fire. Somewhere to the south, Walder Frey was counting plates. Somewhere far farther, a girl with smoke in her hair was teaching fire to behave. Somewhere behind him, a boy with a wolf inside him was learning the names of things that do not send ravens. Ahead, the wall rose in his mind, and then, as the days shortened in the air, a line between the world that believed in the way seasons behaved and the part that had forgotten how. When they reached the King's Road and found it rutted deeper than a plow's furrow and hard as stone, he thought of the men who had built it and the men it had broken. When they crossed the last river, the ice sang under the horses' feet, and Dolorous Ed made a noise like a man who had been told his meal had been replaced by the memory of a meal. When the first ranger post appeared, a low hut under the lee of a hill with a black banner hanging limp and the smell of old smoke, Ned's heart nodded in a small place and retied itself in a different one. He had been a boy when he first saw the wall, and as with all great things men see when they are boys, he had made it bigger in memory. This time, when it loomed pale as a cliff reaching into a sky that seemed to lower itself to meet it, he realized memory had been a miser. The real thing was worse. Jeor Mormont met him in the shadow of a gate made for giants and hugged him without ceremony. The way men do who believe ceremony killed a friend once. "I sent you a man who talks too much," he said. "He talks less where he came from." "He talked enough," Ned said. "That's more than most." "Good," Jeor said. "You can talk to my officers. They've had enough of me." They spoke in the Lord Commander's chamber with the fire low and the table covered in maps and knives to hold them down. Ben-Jen was not there because he never came back from the ride that had taken him into the trees. The hole where he should have been was the shape of a door left open in winter. They spoke of the way the cold had teeth and ate sounds. They spoke of the way fires sometimes went out as if a breath had passed over them. They spoke of men who woke without breath while their chests rose and fell, and then stopped rising and falling and kept walking anyway. They spoke of spears that broke when they should have bent and of armor that cracked like glass. They did not speak much at all of gods. "Everything you brought," Jeor said at last, "we will use, and we will use it up. And then we will use the men we are and the wood we have and the stone we can pry out of the ground with the ends of our fingers. This is not a siege that ends. This is weather. I have sent word south," Ned told him, "and I will send more. And I will go back and stand people in their doorways and tell them to look north until their eyes water." Jeor grunted something that could have been approval in a man whose throat had forgotten how to make a softer sound. "You'll stay long enough for the ranging," he said. "You wanted to see a thing that needed seeing. Now's your chance. We ride in 3 days. Take your sleep while you can still be picky about where it happens." Ned slept with his cloak over him on a pallet that had held other men and more fleas than honor, and woke at the sound of Ghost howling. No, of a wolf in his memory howling, because Ghost belonged to the boy with the vows and the red-eyed beast by his side. And that boy had eyes that looked past Ned even when they looked at him. He found Jon atop the wall with his hands on the ice the way Bran put his hands on the weirwood. "Father," Jon said, and then stopped because the word was a wall the world had built inside him, and he could not find the gate. Ned put his hand on the ice next to his and left it there until his skin hurt. "I came to see where you had decided to stand," he said. "Somewhere there are men who call this madness," Jon said, and his breath made a plume that the wind tore into pieces. "Down there," he nodded toward the world. "Up here it feels like sense. The kind of sense that kills you if you forget it for a second." "You sound like Stannis," Ned said. "I sound like myself," Jon said, and that made Ned smile, which made Jon smile, which made both of them stop because smiling felt like admitting there were things you could lose. They stood there until the light failed and then moved away from the edge as if it had teeth. When they rode out, 500 men with black cloaks and bleak humor and more courage than any man with sense would bury under snow. Ned rode among them with a weight he recognized from the first day he and Robert had left the Vale behind. It was the weight of feeling the world shift under your horse's feet to accommodate a story larger than your life. He looked back once and saw the wall ripple as if it were a skin stretched over a breathing thing, and he did not look back again. They found tracks that no animal in any of Gior's books made, and they set them ablaze with torches soaked in bear fat, and the tracks burned with a smell like cold itself on fire. They came to a ring of stones old enough that even the rocks forgot the hands that stacked them, and the horses balked and the men balked and the crows did not land. In a copse of trees they came across a camp the shape of men's fear. Ashes still warm, kettles overturned, a single mitten half full of frozen blood. "They ran," Corrin said. "From what?" "From what they felt," Gior said. "They'll come back when their brains stop thinking and start wanting." They saw none of the things Bran had named, and every night the men looked over their shoulders anyway. The wind found the seams in their clothes and pushed fingers in, inquiring like a landlord who has heard a rumor. Snow hissed against cloaks and the hiss never stopped. A man told a joke about a wench in Eastwatch, and nobody laughed because they all knew which wench, and the part of the story with the punch had nothing in it that made a man want to let sound out of his mouth. On the fifth night, something big moved at the edge of the firelight and did not come in. The horses shuddered and blew and rolled their eyes. Men who had names for every animal that walked or burrowed or flew did not say a single one. Ned rose with his sword in his hand, and his leg remembered being hurt and did not matter. The thing moved on. Snow fell louder. Jon stood across the fire with Ghost at his knee and looked like a boy somebody had carved out of old ice and put a breath into and then told to remember it was a breath and not a wind. When the ranging turned back, because you must learn the shape of a thing before you hit it, and they had learned enough to know the shape was larger than their hands, Ned said to Gior, "I will carry this south on my back if I have to." "You will have to," Gior said, "but a cart will help." He gave Ned a bundle of bones tied with a thong of skin that had once belonged to something that did not believe in thongs. "This is what we burned," he said. "It was a hand until it decided it wasn't. Let the Lord smell it." On the road south again, Ned passed through a winter that had decided to be honest about itself. He rode with a bag that smelled wrong and a set to his jaw that made small folk who had always wanted to ask for one thing or another decide to wait until spring. Near Mole's town, a group of spearwives he didn't know fell into step and then veered toward the east. He never learned what they hunted. Near the long lake, two boys walked across the ice to give him a trout, and he gave them a coin their father would melt for a knife, and that was the world arranged briefly in a pattern he liked. When he returned to Winterfell, the letter from Theon was waiting, and Catelyn had set it where the light fell longest, and Nugger the kennel master had walked by twice with dogs who did not like the smell of it. "I am coming north with news you will not like, and a ship you will like even less, and a story that isn't over. If I do not come, burn this and the ship both. Asha is going to Lannisport. Balon is going to the Moat. I have been to Bear Island, and it is not what father thinks it is. It is teeth, and it is mother's." There were smudges on the paper where Theon had put his hand down and changed his mind and lifted it and changed it again. From the south came a different set of words. a raven with a red ribbon trailing that smelled faintly of smoke and salt. Stannis had taken ships farther up the coast and burned 3 of the Tyrell's fat merchants where the chain did not reach, and then pulled away before the scorpions could make a porcupine out of him. He would do it again. He would do it again until a gate opened. And with that raven another, with words that looked like they had been written with a finger in ash. The Tyrell girl smiles and talks of soup. The hand was Varys's. The meaning was anyone's. At Riverrun, Brynden Tully and Edmure used the flood to their advantage for once and sent fire rafts down to eat the ropes of Tywin's big idea. Half the cofferdams went. The rest held. The moat rose and went sour, and the corpses in it turned and bumped one another as if they had questions only they could answer. Tywin recounted. That was his talent. He almost never raged. He added up the world and subtracted the parts he could afford to lose and multiplied the parts he meant to keep by threats. At the Twins, Walder Frey added another chair to his high table and named it Paramount. He stared at it as if the chair might grant him wishes if he looked long enough. His daughters fussed and his sons laughed and his grandsons ate, and the bread tasted of damp, as it always did in that place. Far to the east, in a city whose name changed in every mouth that carried it to Westerosi ears, a girl with 3 small dragons on a balcony listened to a merchant tell a tale about a lioness drowned in winter and asked how cold a thing had to be to remember its own cold forever. She put her hand out and the dragon put its hot little head against it, and everything in her face went soft. Fire remembers too, she said. We will see which memory is longer. Under the heart tree, Bran fell asleep with Mira's net over his lap and dreamed of a cave where light came from stones and voices came from water, and of a man with a face half-eaten by moss who told him a story so old it hurt to hold it. In the story, the world was made of a promise and a lie and something else that had no name because naming it made it start moving. When he woke, the net had left little marks on his skin like a map. In the yard, Brienne knocked Arya flat and Arya laughed and rolled and jabbed, and Brienne grinned with the sudden wonder of someone who had been given a thing they didn't know could still be given. Joy that had nothing to do with winning. Sansa sewed a wolf's head in black silk on a pennon and then unpicked it and sewed it again better. Rickon ran with the dogs and came back dirty and happy and screaming about something he had seen that no one else could find, and that satisfied him. Roose Bolton's men came back with rumors that had teeth marks on them, and Roose smiled with all the parts of his face that can smile and said nothing, which is sometimes how a man tells you everything you need to know about what he is not going to do yet. Ned stood on the wall walk in a wind that had decided to be the kind that presses you against stone like a hand, and he looked north and thought of the line he had just crossed and would have to cross again and again. He thought of Robert under sail toward a storm, and of Stannis under sail toward a chain, and of Tywin stringing ropes across a river, and of Walder setting a chair for himself and calling it favor, and of a girl with fire and a boy with roots and a man with a hammer and a dead queen and a living spider and a half-hand and a grey joy and grey grief. What are we, in the end? He asked the cold air, because asking the gods outright always felt like walking into a room without knocking. Men, the air might have said if it had been the kind that talked. And winter. He drew the wolf pommel dagger and turned it in his hand until the little head caught a scrap of pale sun. We will see which memory lasts, he said, repeating words that had never reached his ears. Then he sheathed the blade and went down into the keep, where men waited with problems that could be solved with bread and wood and listening, and where children waited with problems that could not be solved and would be anyway, because that is what you do when you are a father and the winter is not going to ask whether you feel like it. The bells rang for the council. The door closed. The wind outside kept talking to itself in a language the old gods invented and the new gods did not understand, and every hearth in Winterfell answered with flame that refused to forget its heat. Somewhere out in white drifts that made their own hills, a fox curled in its hole and dreamed of a hen. Somewhere above a river with no bridge, a crow pecked at a shred of gold on a stone and found it not to its taste. Somewhere far, far beyond anything men had drawn on a map, blue eyes opened in the dark and did not blink. The day moved forward because days do, dragging all of them with it, and the story remembered itself and kept going. The council table wore the scars of more winters than any man in the room and kept the secret of each of them beneath its knotted grain. Ned sat at its head with a cup untouched and spread his palms upon the old wood as if to feel the heartbeat of the keep that had held his fathers and would one day hold his sons if the world permitted. Midge Mormont had already thumped her fist into a notch the size of a thumb bone and sworn to make a companion notch in a Lannister skull. Galbart Glover measured distances with his forefinger the way masons do. Roose Bolton arranged a row of bean pebbles into a crescent that meant nothing to anyone but him. Great John hunched with his elbows wide as gateposts and grinned whenever someone said anything that involved striking. "What we can send to Riverrun are men who eat and horses that tire," Ned said. "And what Tywin can send back are stones that kill and water that rots. We harry, not break. We make a noise of wolves and keep his ears from hearing what Stannis and the city do to each other." "Noise!" Great John boomed. "I can bellow loud enough to flush stags from a winterwood and scare the shit out of a lion. Let him bellow and me bite," Midge said. "My girls hunger. The twins will listen harder to purse than pride," Galbart added. "Walder hears coin in thunder. Then we will thunder," Ned said. "Wyman will ship casks upriver and give them away to the first fry who smiles. If no fry smiles, we will send twice as many casks and look for grandchildren. Great houses can be edged by small doors." Roose toyed with a pebble. "Riverrun is a mouth," he murmured. "Block the teeth and a man will starve on soup. Bite him though, and sometimes the blood warms him. Cold will do more than steel." "Cold is our ally," Ned agreed. "But famine is no friend. We will not burn fields we may need. We will not salt ground. We will put men where the lions want to put their feet, and we will make their steps cost them." "And you?" Catelyn asked from his right. "You will not go back to the wall at once?" The question lacked the plea that lived behind it. Her hand said what the words did not. "In 3 days," he said. "I'll leave men at every village and walk with them until I am sure they know which way is north even in the dark." He reached for her fingers and brushed a knuckle with his thumb. "Jon has a voice the watch will heed, but the lords of the south don't know his name. They know mine." Bolton lifted his pale eyes. "Names help, and so does spectacle. Send them a thing to smell." Ned nodded once. Gior sent bones. He saw the way stomachs tightened around the table even before he reached for the sack at his feet. The thong creaked. He did not open it yet. There are some realities that kill appetite and clarity both. "After," he promised the room. "Eat now. We'll meet again at moonrise." They ate with the forced cheer of men unwilling to give fear a seat. Afterward, when the candles had burned lower and the air had grown thick with tallow, he untied the thong and let the truth out. He saw men wince who never winced at steel, and men look away who had seen their first dead before their first hunt. Bolton did not blink. Midge swore softly. The pebbles at Roose's elbow lay in a shape now like an eye. "Proof," Ned said. "It's not a story I'm carrying south." That night he let the heat of the gods would soak into him and came away smelling of sap and cold stone. He slept a few hours with Catelyn's hair beneath his palm and woke to the soft scuff of leather. Jojen Reed standing in the doorway with Mira behind him and Bran supported between them, his face pale with the seriousness of boys who have learned the shape of their waking. "It's worse when you look away," Bran said, as if continuing a conversation that had not begun. "I mean the wall and the thing behind it." "I'm not looking away," Ned said. "I've been north. I'm going again." "You won't find the place where the worst of it lives by riding to it," Jojen murmured. "It is a door that opens under your foot when you think you've found a stone. Sometimes," Mira added, helpful and cheerful both, "you don't need to find the worst of it. You need to find where it is going to step next." Ned gathered Bran with a care that startled him by how accustomed it felt. "Then we must make sure the stone I stand on holds." In the morning he saddled for White Harbor and the King's Road both. Robb walked the yard with him and took the last of the counsel a father can give a son going to his own war. "Trust what you know," Ned said. "Question what you want. Share with your mother what you don't want to say aloud. And do not leave Roose alone with any power larger than a knife." Robb smiled at that despite the weight behind his eyes. "I'll put him next to Great John at meals," he said. "The noise will keep him sleepy. The noise will keep him measuring, Ned said. Lions aren't the only beasts that count. He left with 20 men and the sack that smelled of wrong winter and reached White Harbor the second evening with snow in their beards and tongues, and the harbor frozen in elegant panes that cracked in delicate thunder as galleys nosed through. Wyman Manderley roared greetings and stacked meat and bread high enough to feed a talking ox, then sat with his knees spread and his hands folded like a bishop about to condemn a heresy. Stannis' fleet can shelter at Seal Rock if need be, Wyman said. I've men on those islands who know how to light a beacon with a seal's breath. I'll ship grain to Eastwatch. I'll ship it until I have to grind my own walls. He glanced at the sack and did not ask. He had already drawn in his chin and set his mouth like a man who had bitten a seed that tasted of iron. It's not the first winter to send back bones. It is the first to send bones that behave like nothing that belongs to Earth, Ned said. We'll need more than walls against that. Wyman's hand closed into a slow fist. Then we'll be the wall and we'll hope the wall holds. When he rode south from White Harbor, Gior's bones swaying at his saddlebow, the world spread flat and unadorned and took snowfall with the bored inevitability of men accustomed to standing in lines. At an inn where the roof leaked in 17 places, he showed the bones to a pair of wolf actors who had laughed at the talk of Walking Dead and then did not laugh again. At a village where the Septon's roof had caved, he showed them to a Septon who set aside his blessing bowl and sat down as if the bench had betrayed him. At a toll gate held by a petty lord with a tart mouth, he showed them and then did not pay. The gate opened anyway. Fear is a coin better than gold when men agree on what terrifies them. He reached the Crossroads Inn at the Trident's Fork in a wind that rolled across the fields like a quilt being shaken. The innkeep had his father's face and his son's hair and a fear of speaking the news he wanted to know. Ned bought him out of it with grain and counsel. The next morning he moved west with 5 men, the rest bound for Riverland's villages that would carry those bones further than his horse could manage. He saw smoke before he saw Riverrun's towers. Tywin's cofferdams looked like low black horses holding the river's head down with their hooves. Fire rafts drifted in the moat, banging against one another with dull sounds like blind men knocking skulls. Ned posted his men in the scrub and walked the last furlong with a white strip tied to his sleeve and his name shouted by a boy with a reed pipe voice whose breath smoked in bursts. He passed between bored pikemen who tried to be insulting and didn't have the energy. Tywin Lannister received him standing, which was either courtesy or a way of saying I am not tired, and men like him liked their messages to say 2 things at once. He wore plain boiled leather under a fur cloak. Simplicity in a man like that means either poverty or confidence. Ned knew which. He placed the sack upon the table between them and untied it without flourish, because men who did not flinch at hanged sons sometimes flinched at a hand they did not understand. Tywin did not flinch. He did not move at all. The candle by his elbow guttered and sputtered. A small line appeared beside his nose, as if the smell of wrong winter had given him an itch he would not dignify. You bring me old bones, he said. Gior's careful hand lay on the thong. Ned slid the parchment out and held it up beneath the candle. He read the words about burning and not burning, about oil and wrong cold. He read them again. Tywin's face absorbed them like stone thrown into deep water. The ripples did not show. And what? Tywin asked at last. Would you have the lions do with this knowledge, Lord Stark? Withdraw, Ned said. Go home. Teach your lords to bind their dead and burn them. Send wood north. Send men if you have men to spare after you've guarded your own hearths. There is a war that is not of you and me. Tywin studied him the way a man studies a hawk that has flown back to his glove with someone else's blood on it. There are always wars that are not of me, he said finally. And yet I always find soldiers left in them. I did not bring snow to the Riverlands, Stark. I brought rope. You brought a flood, Ned said. And a flood is nothing but winter under a different name. For a heartbeat. 2-3 Tywin's eyes changed. Something like admiration crossed them and arranged itself into something like disgust. You cannot win with words, Eddard. I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to count. How many men will you have left when you've starved a castle of fish to death? He nodded toward the bones. How many will you have left when your corpses forget to lie still? Tywin covered the bones with the sack as if he had decided the table despised them. If I withdraw, Stannis will come upriver and pretend he has done a good thing. The city will make broadsheets. My grandchildren will chew treason with their bread. Ned saw the crack then, the single place in the gold where fear lived. It had not been Cersei's death. Or Jaime's wound. It was the idea of grandchildren under anyone else's law. I won't tell you not to love them, he said. I will tell you the law has a better chance of keeping them breathing than your pride. Tywin did not laugh. He did not do things so untidy as laughing. Withdraw? He repeated, tasting the word as if it were a thing he had bitten once and found a bone shard in. Perhaps. Or perhaps I break Riverrun and become the man on the only horse left worth feeding. Then I ride home with bread and necks. You can break Riverrun, Ned said, and then you will have fewer men to fear the winter with. He did not speak of Cersei. Men like Tywin keep grief like a gemstone they do not wear. When he left the tent, Brynden Blackfish caught his elbow and pulled him into shadow like a fisherman with a net. He doesn't want to hear it, Brynden said. But he heard it, the way a man hears a chill in his own bones. If he pulls away, it won't be because he believed you. It will be because he feared something else more. We'll let him think that. What are you doing with those fires? Ned asked, nodding toward the smoldering rafts. Teaching his dams to do a better trick, Brynden said. He keeps learning that fish can bite through rope if you throw enough rope. I mean to make the rope choose us. He squinted at the sky, which had gone white to the horizon. You keep your wolves to the neck. The rest is Weirwater. He grinned. Ask your boy. Ned rode east from Riverrun with 6 men and 10 thoughts and a wind that left a taste of coal upon his tongue. He slept 3 hours a night and walked the 4th with the bones. Near the crossroads, a wagon train of fry flour passed with guards who turned their faces away and whistled badly, and he wondered whether Walder's chair had grown comfortable yet. He turned north at the Green Fork and reached the neck in a day of sleet that rang on his helm like pebbles. There, in the half-world where islands walk and water pretends to be ground, he found Howland Reed by the simple method of saying his name under his breath until the reeds answered. They sat in a hut that seemed not to have been built so much as persuaded to grow into the shape of men, and Howland said nothing for half the time and half as much as that in the rest of it. You will not keep them from stepping on your stones, he said, but you can make them think the stones are the wrong shape. Lady Stark's father used to say that the river decides the bank. The bank thinks otherwise. The river is right. And what does the neck decide? Ned asked. The air men breathe when they climb out, Howland said. We can make it smell like home to you and like a grave to lions. He sipped peat bitter tea and tilted his head. Your boy dreams under trees now. Good. Trees are old. The old things remember faster. Does remembering help? Ned asked. It keeps you from stepping where the ice is thinnest, Howland said, and sometimes it lets you see the fish under it. He set his cup down. The Ironborn are gnawing at your west like dogs at a bone. They'll leave Marrow because they don't know what Marrow is good for. The women of Bear Island do know. Send them away to sharpen their knives and hold their children's bellies full, and they'll make you a coast the sea detests. Ned sent a raven from a crannock tower with a roof of live reeds. Tar, nails, rope, flour, salt, honey, knives, oil. In return, he received a note from Meage Mormont in a hand as blunt as her speech. I will take your rope and tie it around the Kraken's throat. Send me a man who can teach my littlest how to thrust under a shield. She stabs like a fish. Ned sent Brienne for a week and a half. When she returned, she had a cut on her cheek and a richer sound to her laugh. The sea sent back its own letter. It arrived on the decks of half a dozen charred hulls drifting toward Lannisport like bad news in a tide. Asha Greyjoy had come in at midnight with sails black and oars wrapped in lambswool and burned the Lannister keys to their pilings. She set fire to 6 cogs and 3 warships and cut the moorings on 7 more so that they drifted into each other like drunks at a wedding, then slid out with her girls laughing low and hard. Tyrion stood on the city's seawall next morning and watched men with hooks haul the dead up and thought, with a grimace, that he should have expected her to do exactly what she had done, even though he had done everything he could to make her think he expected it. He wrote to Tywin, "Close your river. They've opened your sea." He wrote to Stannis, "If you're going to come, now would be a time when you could plausibly say you had the wind." He wrote to Oberyn Martell just because he enjoyed the way Oberyn answered letters. "A lioness drowned, a kraken on your doorstep, snow in your soup. When you come, bring something besides wine." Oberyn's reply made him laugh in a way that hurt his ribs. "I will bring a story that ends with a lion's corpse and a laugh that doesn't." Asha's raid forced Tywin's hand as neatly as if she had placed her palm against his wrist and pressed. He hauled down one siege tower, then another, the way a man with too many weapons on his belt sheds knives before he falls in a river. He left the Blackfish a moat ankle-deep in rotten corpses and an oath thick as mud. He rode south with a host that seemed to take up the whole width of the road like a moving wall of iron. Walder Frey watched him go and counted the horses that did not stop. He sent a letter north in a careful hand that had forgotten what carefulness was for. "I am neutral. My bridges remain shut to all but food and singers." He opened them to neither. Stannis took Robert ashore at Storm's End in rain sharp enough to sting and words short enough to bruise. They laid the king in the crypts with cloth of gold and the hammer on his chest. Selmy's white cloak looked gray by lantern light. Salt gleamed at his temples. Stannis put his hand on the cedar and thought a prayer that had no god to hear it, and then said aloud the words men needed to hear instead. "He was my brother and a king, and not enough of either. He kept his word when he could. I will keep mine when I cannot." Later, under the lee of the seaward wall, Davos said, "That sounded like a jest, my king." And Stannis gave him a look that could have polished brass. "It was not," he said. "It was arithmetic. We have fewer numbers than lions. We have more numbers than snow. Pick battles that let you use what you have more of." Melisandre climbed the wall that night and watched lightning dance like eager snakes far out where sea and sky met. She let 3 leeches fat with king's blood hiss upon coals. "Joffrey," she whispered to the first. "Walder," to the second. "Tywin," to the third. Davos stood with his hands in fists and stared at the dark until his eyes saw things that were not there, and then he stared until they went away. On the wall again, the great ranging formed like frost upon a window. Slowly, intricately, with patterns that no man could predict and every man could admire if he had the luxury. Gior set his hand to the map and left sweat on the parchment and grunted. "We go to the fist," as if the old ring of stones had issued the order itself. Jon checked his straps twice and then a third time and put his palm on Ghost's head, and Ghost closed his eyes and leaned into it and made a sound that was older than men with cloaks. Sam tried to smile and found his mouth not interested. He checked his quills instead. Qhorin Halfhand rode in at dusk with 6 men and long shadows and said, "There are fires up there where no men should be making fires. If they are men, they are too many. If they aren't men, they are not." Ned did not go. He could not. He left a wagon of oil and a promise of more oil and a sack of bones that had done their work and did not need to continue to stink in a place where everything else stank of discipline and fear. He pressed Jon's forearm until he felt bone. "Come back," he said, and Jon said, "Yes," in the tone of boys who have decided their answer long before anyone asks a question. He rode south under a sky that had turned the color of wetted slate and did not change for 3 days and then changed in an hour into a clear brittle blue that cut. The rivers he had crossed on his way north were something else now, wider, meaner, uninterested in horses. He forded at a shallows that tried to be deeper and then gave up and walked his men along the banks until they found a place where the bank had given up instead. He slept 2 hours a night, 3 when the wind leaned. He spoke to small lords with big fears and to shepherds with sheep that had not lambed when they should. He showed the bones less as he went. The news had run ahead. Sometimes truth does when it is hungry enough. When he knocked at the gate of the Eyrie, the sound came back smaller and colder than it had gone in. Lisa did not receive him. Her steward did, with a nose that sniffed constantly as if the air insulted him. "The lady is indisposed," he said. "She has been indisposed since her husband died, and that state has not changed." Ned looked past him at the emptiness of the Eyrie sky courtyards and said, Tell her that the wall will fall if the veil does not remember what the veil is for." The steward's mouth trembled. He asked for a letter. Ned gave him one and knew it would be burned, and wrote another when he reached the bottom of the mountain, and sent it to every small lord with a canyon for a hall and a hawk for a banner. "If the eyrie will not rise," he wrote, "be the eyrie where you stand." At Harrenhal, charred stones glistened with melt, and the shadows the towers cast looked like fingers reaching for a thing they could not reach. Arya had passed through there once in stories that came in with salt cellars and out with men who had lost a finger for stealing and would now steal with the other 9. A company of sellswords with a rooster sigil had taken the main hall for a night and then left at dawn when the wind told them the place had decided it did not like men who slept without listening. Ned stood in the courtyard and looked up and thought of how much time it takes to make a ruin and how little to use one. He rode on. Theon came back in a ship that had traded its sails 3 times and its captain twice. He carried scars that looked like the sea had decided to write its name upon him in a hand that did not believe in spelling. He had a bare tooth on a thong around his neck and a smell of smoke and salt that clung to him like a defeated oath. "They tried me at Bear Island," he said to Ned in the hall with the wolves' heads and the smells of broth and iron. "Not for breathing. For being who I was when I walked in. They gave me a knife and a rope and a choice. The rope wasn't for me." He touched the tooth. "I sharpened the knife." "Your father?" Ned asked. "Will take the moat," Theon said. "Or try. Asha will take Lannisport again if they give her a chance." "They won't." Tired grin. "They'll try to, though. That's the thing about lions, they believe lessons last." "What lesson did you learn?" Caitlin asked. "That a woman with a child in her arms can kill me faster than any man with an axe," Theon said, and something like shame and something like pride fought in his eyes and took turns winning. "And that when she looks at me after, it will be worse than if she hadn't." Ned put his hand on the bare tooth and felt the ridges where the bear's life had learned to grind itself down. "Then you learned the only lesson worth traveling for," he said. "Who we are when men aren't watching." Word came that Stannis had drawn up his fleet under cover of fog and rowed into Blackwater Bay with oars muffled in wool and firepots wrapped in wet cloth and lit only at the last heartbeat, and that he had thrown green and orange and blue into the air at once like a man setting a festival for gods, and that the chain had come up too late or too soon depending on who told the story and whether they wanted Tyrion to look clever or foolhardy. Word came that he had not taken the city but had taken away the belief that the sea belonged to lions. Word came that Marjorie had stood beside Joffrey on a balcony the next day and handed bread to boys with bones like sparrows and looked into the eyes of every mother in the crowd as if she knew what their kitchens smelled like and would put a pot on herself if their fires went out. Word came that Tywin had turned west to deal with the Krakens and that he had sent a letter written in a hand that could cut meat to Walder Frey that said simply, "Open." Word came that Walder had written back, to whom? Word came that Oberyn Martell had ordered a new haft for his spear and a new shirt for his chest, and that he had kissed each of his snakes on the hair and told them a story about a mountain and a skull that they would hear again and again until they understood what stories were for. At the wall, a bird flew south and south again with a strip tied to its leg that said, "We have gone to the fist. We will come back with the night at our heels or not at all." The bird fell in a storm and a boy picked it up and brought it to a hedge knight who had forgotten what his hedge looked like. The knight brought it to a sept who fed it and read it aloud to his god. The god did nothing but listen better than men. The knight sold the strip for bread to a tanner who could not read. The tanner wrapped it in a piece of hide and used it to fix a rake, and the rake's handle rubbed the ink away and memory took over where ink left off because memory always tries even when it cannot. In Winterfell, the wolves woke from a nap as one and lifted their muzzles and harmonized a note that made men set their cups down. In the godswood Bran put his hands on the weirwood and closed his eyes and saw a ring of stones with crows in the bare branches and men wrapped in black like shadows caught in their own nets and white figures in the distance like standing waterfalls. He said none of it because saying a thing like that makes it sharper. He slept afterward and dreamed of summer grass. Ned walked the wall walk and counted torches and thought of the way snow takes sound and carries it away and gives it back later with a difference. He thought of Robert in his cedar bed in the belly of Storm's End and of Stannis on his walls with his jaw set like a man who'd made up his mind to chew hoof. He thought of Tywin counting cogs and horses and sons and difficulties. He thought of Walder counting chairs. He thought of Dorne counting slights and Oberyn counting skulls and Casterly Rock counting waves against its flank because it liked the sound. He thought of the far-off girl whose dragons were practice heat and how men will one day stand in winter and feel summer on their faces and fall to their knees whether they mean to or not. He did not think of peace. He thought of time. Time to move men from where they will die for nothing to where they might die for something. Time to teach small lords how to stack their dead so they burn fast and clean. Time to teach big lords how to count things they do not believe in. Time to put a spear in a boy's hand and a song in his sister's mouth and a fire under a pot where there had been only a story about soup. He slept 2 hours that night and dreamed the sound of ice carving its own name into rock. He woke to the clatter of the yard and the voices of his house and the creak of leather and the smell of porridge. He woke to winter being winter and men being men and the work of both. He woke to a raven at the window with a ribbon tied in black and the words on its strip written in a hand he did not know. The fist is ringed. The trees are wrong. Send fire. He looked north and the sky looked back, expressionless, and somewhere a small piece of the world, that piece that belongs to fathers, folded a map and put it away and took out a rope and a sharp knife and set them on the table side by side. He breathed in. He breathed out. He went down to the hall again, to the council table with its scars, to the pebbles Roose arranged and the fists Meege made and the laughter Greatjon made on purpose, to the wolves in the corners and the girl with a dagger and the girl with a song and the boy with roots in his fingers and the boy who could not be contained in any word smaller than north. The bones were back in their sack by the door, and when light hit the thong just so it gleamed like a line drawn on a map that no man had finished drawing yet. He touched it in passing, the way a man touches a fragment of something he hates and respects, and then he took his seat at the table and set his hands on the old wood and spoke without preface or promise. "Let's count," he said, and the counting began. The pebbles on the council table were still warm from Roose's fingers when the raven struck the window with a sound like a bare hand on wet slate. The bird flailed, righted itself, and pecked at the pane as if it meant to eat the cold itself. Ned rose, caught it, felt its heart battering his palm. The strip tied to its leg was stiff with frost. The ink had crawled in the cold and frozen again, a black bloom. He broke the thong with his teeth and read. The room changed shape without moving. Greatjon's chair rasped. Meege's hand went to the haft of the axe she kept beneath the table as if the words might require it. Roose's pebbles made a new crescent, and if a man had watched him long enough, he would have learned the language of those crescents and feared it. "Fire," Ned said simply, and the word tasted of pitch and oath. "They need fire at the fist and soon." Galbart Glover had a map halfway unrolled before the echo died. "From White Harbor to Eastwatch is 4 days if the wind is right and the crews are mean," he said. 5 if the ice argues. He looked to Wyman's latest tallies. "We have pitch in cask, oil in smaller, torches by the 100. The rest is wood and will, and we have both until the wood runs out and the will with it." "Dragonglass," Osha said from the threshold, the word flat as a board over a ditch. "Men say old knives of glass cut what fire cannot frighten. There's a mountain of it in the south, if the old stories are true." Ned's thoughts leapt ahead of his mouth to Dragonstone's black shores. "Davos can bring it," he said, already seeing the Onion Knight's narrow smile beneath sea salt. "We'll ask Stannis for what his island can spare." Roose lifted his eyes. "And what price will iron desire for stone?" he murmured. "What price does winter put on breath?"
Ned answered,
"If Stannis wants a realm to rule when he is finished with his reckonings, he'll send us obsidian and think the bargain good." He wrote in the old quick hand that had sent orders down the Trident 30 years before. "Obsidian, as much as the mountain will lose without groaning. Nappers to shape it if Dragonstone has such men. Ships to Eastwatch. I'll send what I have: oil, pitch, cloth to meet you. This is not a quarrel we can win with letters. Send rock and we'll make knives. Send knives and we'll make time." He sealed it with the wolf and the stag bound in black, handed it to Hallis Malin and said, "Ride." Hallis did not waste breath on vow. He vanished. The door breathed shut behind him. "Wyman," Ned said. "Your ships." "Our wolves," Wyman answered, as if he had been waiting all winter to say it. They'll hunt the ice and bring back meat. He thumped his chest with a hand like a ham. I'll put my best oarsmen on oars and my worst on prayers. Good, Ned said. Roose, take 200 to the White Knife and meet those cogs with wagons ready. I want pitch on sledges from the river to the King's Road before your men. Remember, they prefer not to pull. Bolton's expression did not change. They rarely forget, he said, but he rose with the grace of a man who will do a cruel task and not grow angry at the cruelty for being itself. I'll bring men who do not complain, or who do so softly. Meege, Ned said. Your girls know how to light a fire in a gale that hates them. Send me 2 score to Eastwatch to teach boys who have only ever lit hearths. They'll go, Meege said, and they'll clout anyone who tells them not to. And the wall. Catelyn's voice slid like a knife through cloth. What do we tell them to do besides burn? Hold, Ned said. Hold until the sea brings knives. He could not go north himself. The north would not bear a lord so fleet of motion that he did not leave tracks. He sent men with names that held weight in the Night's Watch, Serwins, Umbers, Flints, and with them books of oil tallies and bundles of wool and 24 skins of good strong northern spirits that burned like a stove and soothed like a lie. He wrote to Jeor Mormont, "We are moving. Light what you must. Do not trust the cold when it is kind." That afternoon Bran drew in the Godswood. Jojen watched, still as a cat that cannot decide whether to pounce or sleep. The boy's charcoal smeared his fingers and left black moons on the heel of his hand. A circle like the fist, ridges like knuckles, trees clustered in a shape that made the hair on Ned's arms stand despite the double cloak. Bran's mouth moved without sound. He marked the slope where the trail ran narrow and the notch where the ridge split and the hollow where shadows pooled in noon. When he finished, he pushed the scrap into Ned's hand and looked up as if from a deep pool. "They want to go where the snow lies wrong," Bran said. "Not men. The other. The cold that remembers. But the men are going to come down the hollow, and they'll need fire there." He put his charcoal to the paper again, made 3 quick blots. "Not the big fire. The little ones that make a wall where a wall isn't." "Where did you see that?" Arya demanded. She had climbed the heart tree with the quiet of someone who believes trees are ladders provided for the bold. "How?" "In a sleep," Bran said simply. "Ask the tree. It knows." Osha's mouth twisted. "The tree knows more than it can say to men who've come to it late," she said, but her eyes did not leave the drawing. "Send it with the pitch. Men who light fire without learning where to place it waste half their lives burning what doesn't need burning." Ned sent the map with a rider who had slept outdoors every night since he was 5 because his father had loved the hunt more than bread. "Put this in Cotter Pike's hand," he said. "Tell him it came from a raven. He will not ask which tree it flew from." 2 days later, the Manderley cogs shouldered the ice like stubborn bulls, sails furred with rime. Eastwatch's quay groaned. Cotter Pike stood on the seaward wall, his beard a frosting of white, his eyes the color of the sea when it is tired of being hit. "God's damned southerners," he said to the wind, and when the first cask of obsidian chipped into view beneath salted tarpaulins, he said it again with respect tucked into the blasphemy like a knife hidden in bread. Davos came off the second ship in a cloak that had begun life as 3 cloaks and a smile that carried both apology and relief. "Lord Cotter," he said, and his breath smoked. "We brought the mountain." "Brought pebbles," Cotter corrected, nodding at the black chunks. "We'll see if they cut. You bring nappers to teach men who've never shaped anything but lies and iron." Davos lifted his hand and 3 haggard men in sealskins stepped forward, eyes cast down as if they feared the ice would slap them for looking. These men worked Dragonstone when dragon lords still had better uses for fire than burning their dinners, he said. "They say what breaks will still cut if your hand is angrier than your head is wise." "We've got more of the first than the second," Cotter said. He squinted down the quay at the other ship nosing in with pitch and oil. "You brought smell too. Good. The world's going to need to stink for a while." Men with hands like baskets lifted the obsidian and carried it to the old storehouse where the watch kept the ropes that remembered hands older than theirs. Davos's nappers sat cross-legged with knives and antler and began to crack and flake. The the sound a dry chatter like teeth in cold. Arrowheads tumbled into baskets. By midnight there were a few hundred that looked cruel and delicate at once. Cotter grunted approval, then shouted at boys to fetch shafts and glue. "We'll make gray snowmen bleed," he told them, "or we'll die wishing we'd tried." 3 days after the cogs cut out again with empty bellies and men on their decks swearing to be back, the first ravens from the Fist reached Eastwatch, wild-eyed and pecking their own legs bloody where the leather bit. They carried scraps, and the scraps carried words like knives. Horns 3, fire, circle, night. A second clutch bore only inkblots where hands had slipped on ash or fear. Cotter read them aloud to a room that smelled of pitch, and the men listening set the arrowheads down and lifted them again like men testing the weight of their own names. Samwell Tarly did not see the ravens go. He had looked after the birds at Castle Black and loved them as boys love things with simpler hungers than their own. On the Fist, the wind had a voice he could not remember when he woke from sleep, and that terrified him more than the horns. Horns were for men. Wind was for the world. He crouched under the lee of a half-buried stone and tried to keep the ink from freezing inside his pen and watched the snow fill the spaces between footfalls as fast as men made them. He had written send and then send fire and then had crossed out fire because it felt presumptuous to tell the gods of the South what to do, and then he had written it again because it wasn't the gods he was telling, it was men who had already learned to listen when the world got simple and said burn or die. Jeor Mormont's beard was a rhymed sculpture. He stood in the ring of the old stones with his sword in his hand and his jaw clenched, and he had the look of a man who knows what it costs to tell boys not to run. "Hold," he said, and his breath smoked. "Hold and knock them down when they come and burn what falls, and do not forget to cover your brothers when they fall. We leave when I say leave. We leave when the living are not in our way." The first horn call was a question. The second was a warning. The third loosened something in men's bowels that no drill sergeant had ever acknowledged. The trees around the ring decided to be statues. Snow seemed to lift from the ground on its own and whirl. The air went cold in a way that made the words cold and air both admit they were not equal to their work. They came like a silence. Men tell stories about things that come like wind and flame and flood because those are the things men know. This was a quiet that stepped into the world and pushed sound out of it one pace at a time. The first man to loose an arrow loosed it at nothing, and the second loosed it at an outline he would later insist was a man, and the third loosed it at a blue light. The blue light turned, and the arrow struck, and the arrow fell to powder. Jeor shouted something that had no words, and every man heard it the way they heard their mother cry once when they were little and never forgot. "Fire," someone said in a voice like a boy on his name day. Torches flared. Pitch spat. Whites came on in a shuffling, tireless ring, eyes empty of everything but their assignment. Behind them, beyond them, the things that were not men watched with the patience of ice. Sam's hands would not stop shaking. He lit rope with rope and burned his glove and cursed out loud and started crying and then laughed at himself while he cried. Gren knocked an arm off a thing wearing a watchman's cloak, and Sam turned away and retched and then turned back because turning away is what you do when your heart is a liar. He had a bag at his hip that clinked, and he had put it there without telling anyone because he had found the dragonglass cache in the old ring, and he had wanted one thing in the world that did not belong to fear. He did not draw a blade yet. He held a torch until it burned his fingers, and then he held another. When the order came, it was not so much an order as a relief. Back, back, back. The ring contracted. Men collapsed their tents with their feet as they ran and ran straight through the canvas to make it go faster and laughed in a way they would not remember later. The dead pressed, then stalled as fire took the snow into steam and the steam into a wall. Someone beat the flames with a cloak, and Jeor hit him in the head with the flat of his sword, and the man went down and did not get up again, and Jeor never looked to see whether he breathed. They left the Fist in pieces, in squads, in pairs, in memories. They left a ring of burned bones that would look like a ritual to someone who had not been there and like a failed ritual to those who had. They left with 3 horns still echoing in their marrow and the sound of a silence that would visit them in sleep. They left in weather that no longer pretended to be anything but enemy. They left, and the things that stood beyond the line of trees watched them go the way a man watches a rat he has decided to let lead him to a nest. In the haunted forest, Corrin half-hand counted and subtracted and multiplied and made the sum come out the way he wanted it to, because that is what men like him do until the one time they cannot. He looked at Jon Snow over the heads of men who were not going to come back and nodded once. "You go," he said. "Learn. Tell us where the fire should be before the snow arrives. Become what you have to for a while and remember to stop." Jon's face made a new shape. "You mean me to?" "I mean you to go where you can still breathe," Corrin said. "I'll give you a fight worth singing about so they let you live long enough to become a lie. Don't make the lie your only name." Ygritte's hair was foxfire in dimness. He had spared her once because something in him that had not been trained by men with cloaks had told him to, and because he had not wanted to hear the sound a woman makes when her life is stolen. Now she cocked her head and watched Corrin with a look that had more hunger in it than cruelty. "We'll see whether the crow can fly with a broken wing," she said. Jon did not answer. He didn't trust his mouth. When Corrin fell, he did it the way men who choose their deaths fall, in a spiral of feints and provocations and openings given on purpose. Jon's blade slid where a lesser man's pride would have sealed the gap. Corrin's eyes showed satisfaction and permission and loss in the same breath, and Jon stumbled backward into a new story he had not written for himself. Ghosts stayed in the trees long enough to be sure Jon was not going to be killed for cowardice. He padded beside a shadow woman who laughed when snow hit her braids and vanished when she rubbed her hands together. He turned and ran west then, because he had been made for men who smelled like home, and Eastwatch smelled like oil and wolves and Davos's tar-clogged honesty. He found Cotter Pike by a pyre that hissed black and pressed his head against the man's thigh. Cotter swore and then did not swear and scratched the white fur and said softly, "Right then," as if given an order by a thing that would not waste speech. The obsidian arrowheads came off the line faster than men could glue them when a boy saw his first arrow made and began making the third before anyone had told him how. The first time one of them struck a white, it buried itself where the eye had been, and the thing fell like a puppet dropped by a child who has decided to pick up a different toy. The first time one of them struck a white figure beyond the fire, it went in and smoke came out that smelled like a storm hitting a hot road. The figure shattered, gracefully, like a glass blown too thin. A watchman vomited and then whooped, and both sounds together felt correct. To the south, Tyrion watched illusions in the air above the capital. Smoke, bird flight, gossip. He had papers on his table and wine he did not drink at his elbow, and a small, terrible relief he loathed himself for feeling. "At least," he told the window, "we will not be bored." Joffrey had ordered 3 men hanged that morning for refusing to give bread to a young man in Tyrell Green. Marjorie had visited the widows by noon, and the men had been quietly cut down by dusk. Varys glided in and said a thing in a tone that meant a different thing. Peter promised a loan in a tone that meant appetite. Tyrion wrote to Ned Stark, whose hand he recognized like the walk of a man who limps and refuses to limp. "We are holding, by the kindness of buyers and the fear of sellers. Your Kraken friends keep our navy honest. Your Red God friend keeps our bells oiled. If the winter you warned me about decides to walk to my door, I will send it a map. Otherwise, I shall continue to hold this chair until it breaks beneath me or the boy on the bigger one chokes on a seed." He crumpled and burned that and wrote instead, "We will keep the bay open if we can. Send me salt fish and stories about men who remember their vows. The city likes both." Olenna Tyrell walked in uninvited that afternoon, because older women do that when they have decided men have said enough. "Your lions are short a lioness," she said, settling her skirts with a rustle that made Tyrion think of knives being sheathed. "That makes everything easier in the way that removing a rotten beam does. One is less likely to be crushed, but the roof still leaks. My granddaughter has been practicing patience. It looks like generosity when you put flowers on it." "And what would you ask in exchange for the flowers?" Tyrion asked. "Less stupidity," Olenna said. "Failing that, I'll take wheat." "Wheat I can arrange," Tyrion said. "Less stupidity I have been searching the market for and failing to find." In Riverrun's shadow, Tywin's camp woke to the smell of sea brine and horse. A messenger from Lannisport had brought more than words. a piece of sail ragged with soot, and a list of ships with the dignified little crosses men draw when they write the names of things they did not keep safe. Asha's laughter seemed to hang in the space between the lines. Tywin allowed himself a fraction of a nod to no one and sent a counter-order. West, now. The siege towers came down as clean as if they had not known how to go up. Brynden watched from stone and thought of catfish sucking at a baited hook. "You'll pull up something," he murmured to the cold. "And it won't be what you thought." Walder Frey wrote to both camps and rode to neither. He had a new fur on his chair and a new ache in his hip and a new grandson on his knee, and he told the child a story about bridges that was not for the child. "If you let every man cross," he said, "then no man owes you for crossing." The child stared at his beard and tried to stick a finger into his mouth. Walder let him. "You learn early," he said, "what men will take if you leave it near their hands." In the neck, Howland Reed's people danced by firelight with knives that had grown out of bone and frogs that had given their last labor to soup. Ironborn cursed and sank and learned the difference between a map drawn by men and a road grown by the earth. Balon's captains spat on the bog and the bog spat back into their mouths. The ropes of the causeways had been cut and spliced again, and what had been a path yesterday ended today where a woman with reed-brown hair waited, smiling, with a spear that had never seen a forge. Asha's ship returned to the Iron Isles with laughter leaking from its seams and rope burned black where it had kissed a flaming quay. She stood with one foot on the rail and drank flat beer that tasted like victory and said, "They'll call it luck, and then they'll die of the next thing because they refuse to learn how to make luck." Beside her, a girl no more than 14 with hands seamed by rope nodded as if speaking to the sea. "We'll do it twice," the girl said. "They won't believe the first time wasn't a trick." Asha ruffled her hair with a hand that had split knuckles. "That's right," she said. "They want stories. We'll give them 2 of the same story and tell them one was a lie." On Bear Island, Brienne left 3 bruises on girls who grinned with pride as if bruises were medals and left a bruise on her own heart she did not name. She returned to Winterfell with the taste of salt and gratitude in her mouth and found Arya setting chairs on their sides and running at them. "Again!" Arya panted. "Harder." Brienne obliged. Sansa rapped Arya's knuckles afterward and did not scold, and Arya glared at her and then said, "Thank you," like a girl promising a favor she would repay with interest. Oberyn Martell came north on a horse that disliked snow but liked attention and got both. He brought with him heat enough to make the hall smell faintly of oranges when he turned his cloak. He bowed to Catelyn as if he had promised someone to be on his best behavior until dinner, and to Ned as if he were greeting a man he had once wanted to kill and now wanted to talk into killing someone else. "The North is as advertised," he said with pleasure. "Honor, hunger, would smoke, also knives. That last is what convinces me." "What convinces you of what?" Catelyn asked. "That I should put my spear where my mouth is," Oberyn said. "I came to hear whether your boy intends to be king of snow or merely its warden. The difference is the color of the cloth you wrap your pride in. Will be what leaves the wall standing when the snow decides to walk," Ned said. "If the realm wants to call that a crown, it can waste its ink. I want food, ships, and a promise you will not cut the legs out from under Stannis until the lions are too busy looking at their own throats to move their paws." Oberyn's grin sharpened. "I have always admired men with appetites," he said, "especially when they have learned to say what they want and not what they think songs want to hear. Dorne will send spears when Dorne will, which is when my brother says, which is when he can tell himself a story about why he did not do it sooner. In the meantime, I'll write to men who like me enough to pretend they aren't afraid of me. They will send you lemons that do not freeze and knives that do." He sat with Sansa and asked for a song that was not about kings. She sang one her mother had taught her long before she had learned that songs can lie so beautifully they don't know they're lying. Oberyn listened without smiling and said, "You have a good ear for the parts that aren't sweet." Later he found Arya striking at a post and said, "You are a good liar with your feet." And she scowled and said, "I'm not lying." And he said, "Exactly." And she liked him a little for seeing her. He slept 2 nights and rode south again into a cold that found the seams in his charm and shoved fingers in. He laughed at it and swore and put his head down and kept going. Men like him burn a track wherever they pass. The snow fell and covered it and remembered its warmth anyway. The obsidian kept coming. Men at Eastwatch learned to strip their arrows faster than they had believed they could learn anything. A Manderley boy with fingers too fat for delicate work discovered he could make blades if he thought of them as fish. He broke them into neat flakes like scales until the napper cuffed him and taught him the rhythm to make a point. In the yard, torches flared by day, because the day needed reminding. At night, men dreamed of silence and woke to the comforting vulgarity of men snoring. The first band of survivors reached the sea on feet that had forgotten what warm meant. Ghost led them. He seemed to grow larger as he came into the torchlight because light wanted him. Gren stumbled, laughing in the way of men who have decided they can laugh or die mad and picked the option that makes their mother's ghosts less disappointed. Sam fell and hands lifted him and he got up and fell and got up and fell until falling and rising had the feel of prayer. Jeor Mormont came in with the last of them, because that is what a commander does, and he collapsed on a coil of rope and blinked at the stars as if they had been rearranged while he was absent. Fire, he croaked, and men hurried as if the word were a whip. Sam slept in a pile of other men and woke to Gilly's hand on his face because she had learned the truth Jon knew. Some men breathe more steadily if someone counts their breaths for them. He whispered to her about a knife of black glass that broke like bread and felt a weight under his hand and realized he had not let go of the bag even in sleep. He ate, he drank, he listened to Cotter Pike curse the ice and the weather and the way men's hands forget what they know when they are cold. He watched the nappers and thought, I can learn that, and then he did not move because another part of him said, you can also learn to run. Cotter read Bran's charcoal map with his head cocked and his mouth align. We'll set fires where your raven tells me the snow wants to be, he said. If the snow is annoyed, it can take it up with the boy who drew it. He did not know he was teasing a tree. He pointed his stick at the notch and the hollow and the ridge and began to order men as if he had always had a god to draw maps for him and had gotten bored waiting. Ned's last letter to Jeor went north tied to a bird that had already flown the road twice. If the fist is lost, do not waste men grieving it. Fall back, light as you go, and send me the names of those who cannot walk so I can burn the paper as if that mattered. Davos brings knives as long as Stannis brings rock. If you need men, say so with numbers. If you need wood, say so with forests. I can move both. If you need a god, pray to the old ones. The new ones like warm houses. Jeor read it and smiled once in a way no man would have believed his face could manage. And then he put it by the lamp and forgot to take it down and the flame blackened it to lace. When Ned was not writing, he was counting. He sat with Wyman and measured salt and oats, with Galbart and measured bridges, with Meege and measured rage, with Roose and measured cruelty and those places where cruelty can be useful to someone who despises it. He saw Theon on the wall at dusk, looking west. If I go back, Theon said without turning, I'll not come back again as myself. Then come back as someone worth introducing to your mother, Ned said, not unkindly. Theon's laugh was small and real. She keeps a knife in her apron, he said. She doesn't need me to be worth introducing. Sansa came to him with paper and asked for a list of words that were true even when weather changed. He gave her bread, water, fire, knife, door. She wrote them in a hand that had become cleaner as the world had grown dirtier. Arya came and asked for a list of things it was always all right to hit. He gave her a man who raises his hand to a child, a dog that won't stop killing sheep, a door on fire, a shield if you need to make a noise. She frowned at the last and then smiled because she saw it. Bran came and asked for nothing and stood with him in silence and put his hand on his sleeve now and then like a boy reminding a tree it had sap. The ravens to Dorne came back with nothing useful except the knowledge that men in deserts dislike cold differently than men in snow. Oberyn sent one more that said, I have told my brother that if he waits too long I will marry the North without him. Ned laughed and read it to Catelyn, who rolled her eyes and said, You'd perish in 2 days married to a man who wants to talk that much. Ned looked at her and said, I married the right woman, and meant it like a man who has learned to say true things out loud because time does not always let you say them later. In King's Landing the cobbles began lifting men's boots when they walked because frost had decided it could. Marjorie pushed soup through a window with her own hands and smiled in a way that earned her 3 oaths and 6 promises from people who did not know yet that the promises they made would keep them from rioting. Joffrey threw a goblet at a man whose only sin had been his face. Tyrion made the man a clerk and paid him in bread. Varys whispered that Stannis had been seen praying, which could mean he had decided he was going to win and wanted to be thanked for modesty later. Walder Frey sent a singer north with a song that had too many verses and not enough truth. The singer stopped at every village and sang it until the villagers learned to sing it back to him, with the parts that made Walder look brave sung soft and the parts that made their own hunger sound like prophecy sung loud. When the singer reached Winterfell, Sansa asked him to sing it once, then thanked him with bread and told him a better ending. He tried to sing that ending south and lost his tongue to the weather before he got to the twins and sang the better ending to himself until he died, which is a kind of victory. The Manderley cogs made 5 trips in 8 weeks and not one was easy. Ice taught the sailors a new alphabet with their knuckles. Davos slept 6 hours in 3 days and dreamed of onion skin and wave. The nappers bled from their hands and kept working. A boy lost 2 fingers and wept with fright at what his father would say until Cotter Pike told him his father would say, "Did you keep the other 8?" And the boy laughed through tears and the whole yard laughed with him. Men learned to light fire in wind by learning how to make their bodies into walls. Fire learned to respect them. It was not enough and it was just enough. The survivors from the Fist staggered into Crasters and into Eastwatch and into dreams no singer would set to strings. Sam killed a thing with a knife of black glass because fear had burned away every layer of him that had believed he could not and left a point. He fell in the snow afterward and sobbed, and Gilly held him and said, "You did a brave thing and a necessary one." The way a woman says, "The pot is boiling," notice, not compliment. He slept beside the wall of a hut while ravens muttered above him like old men doubting everything new, and woke to a world that still needed letters written and fires lit. From the west came news that Tywin had driven Asha into fog and rocks and thought he had beaten her when all he had done was make the sea his enemy. From the south came news that Stannis had taken a fort along the Blackwater that men had forgotten was a fort and put men into it who remembered. From the river came news that Brynden had sent a raft of dead cattle at a dam and turned the river into soup and Tywin's men into carp. From the east came news that a girl with a dragon on her shoulder had eaten an orange and made a face and laughed and taught the dragon to like the peel. There was no singular victory. There was only the work. Ned stood each dawn and counted. He sent men to the wall and to the moat and to the harbors. He sent letters to men he despised when it would keep children breathing. He buried his dead and reminded his living that names matter until the day you learn they do not, and then matter again because you learn they are not for you. He went to the crypts at night and told Robert the jokes he would have told him if they had had more time. He told Lyanna nothing because he had nothing left to tell her that she did not know. One night, when the sky had gone clear in the way that means tomorrow will be cruel, Bran woke with his hands bleeding sap and said, in a small voice that was a bigger voice's echo, "The cold is learning." Ned put a blanket around him that had warmed his sons and daughters in other winters and said, "So are we." In the morning, he went to the table with its scars and set his palms upon it and said, "Again." And they did. They counted the ships, the knives, the breaths, the days. They counted the hours between the first raven and the last. They counted the children and the old men and the wood and the oil and the bags of black glass. They counted the stories worth lying for and the truths worth losing for. They counted, and outside the wind counted too. And for once the numbers seemed as if they might add up to a world men could live in when the counting ran out. The raven from Eastwatch came at noon with its beak cracked and its feathers clotted with salt and bore only 4 words. Hold. Fire bought time. Ned read them aloud, and the men in the hall breathed like men who had been underwater and found a pocket of air. He looked at his wife and his children and his captains and his enemies, not now, and he set his hands flat and he said what a man says when he has taught himself to be honest. "We keep going." Winter howled at the windows. The fires answered. Somewhere in the snow a wolf lifted its head and sang the note that means we are not dead yet, and heard an answering voice from far away that meant neither are we. And that night, when the cold pressed itself against stone and listened to the sound fire makes when it thinks it is alone, it heard another sound beneath it like roots pushing into earth, and it drew back a finger's breadth. Not much. Enough.